Hey, this is Ocean K with an overview of Former, a new wave-shaping synth for Reason. Now this video is going to be just a basic overview of Former. If you're interested in more detailed information, there is a manual that goes into every single thing that Former can do. So if you're interested in that, go to the Propeller Head shop page for Former and look for the manual link, and there you can read all about the details of Former. But for now, let's just take a brief look at what Former can do. Right. So this is the default patch with Former, and we can start with this. So Former is a 4-oscillator 8-operator polyphonic synth. And what that means is that if we start with the oscillator section, there are 4 different oscillators, 4 different oscillator banks for each note. So when you play a note, this particular patch uses all 4 oscillators. And we can listen to them all one at a time. So this is oscillator 1, this is oscillator 2, oscillator 3, and oscillator 4. And we can look at each one of these oscillators in detail just by clicking on the oscillator select button. So this is oscillator 4, this is oscillator 3, this is oscillator 2, and oscillator 1. Right? So we'll bring all those back. And now let's look at all of these knobs for each oscillator. So each oscillator starts as a single cycle waveform, and there are 25 to choose from. So you pick which waveform, which single cycle you want to start with, and once you have that, you can use these wave shapers to change the character of that particular waveform. So for example, you can change, you can bit crush the waveform, you can saturate it, you can do a sync. There's a warp function, a really interesting warp function. You can add harmonics. Spread changes the actual characteristics of the waveform, and there's a pulse width for every waveform. And so using these in combinations, you can come up with some just crazy different sounds. And now each oscillator, right, of the 4 can have completely different settings, can use a completely different source wave, a single cycle. All of these can be different, so you can just get, really complicated layered sounds. Each oscillator also has these sort of basic knobs here. Each one has an independent volume and a pan. Each one can be independently tuned by octave, semitone, and fine tune. And by the way, the octave and the semitones are stepped, so you can lock in exactly, 5 or 6 semitones down. The fine tune is free, so you can get all cents between -100 and 100. You can route each oscillator to its own envelope, and we'll look at that a little later. Each oscillator can go through the filters in different configurations, and I'll show you that. And then each oscillator has its own unison effect to it. And so you set up all of these oscillators to create all your layers, and then they're sent through, as you can see through these little triangles here, they're sent through a signal path. So next comes the filters. Former has 2 identical multimode filters. So there are 3 low pass, 2 high pass, 1 band pass, and 1 notch or band reject. And both of them have the same modes. Each one of them you can change the the frequency and the resonance. And you can change it with these knobs. You can also change it dynamically with the mouse. And each oscillator can go through the different filters in its own order. So for example, oscillator 1 can go through no filters, it can go through filter 1, it can go through filter 2, or it can go through filters 1 and 2. And so you can have oscillator 1 go through filter 1, and oscillator 2 not go through any, oscillator 3 you can go through filter 2, and so on. So each oscillator can go through the filters in its own order. All right. And you'll notice that this oscillator, you see these wave shapers are moving. That's because I have in the modulation matrix, there's a LFO that's changing the oscillator sync. And so it's changing this. You can also have those things change the filters. So we can go ahead and have, let's see, LFO4 change, and I'll explain the modulation matrix a little more in a second. But we can have that change the filter frequency, and we'll go ahead and slow this down. Right, so there we have an LFO changing the filter frequency. So that's your filters. Then there are just some basic effects to help you sort of craft the tone a little more. We've got a basic reverb, and we've got a digital delay. The delay can be tempo synced or free running. You can set the feedback and the right? So pretty standard delay stuff. There's also a tone stack here, a 4-element tone stack. And so what happens is all the oscillators are summed together into a stereo signal. They're passed through the individual filters, and then actually the oscillators are individually, the 4 oscillators are sent individually through the filters, right, independently, and then all of those are summed together. They're put through the reverb, through the delay, and through the tone stack. So right, so this EQ affects the entire stereo signal that comes from the oscillators. So that's a very basic effect section, just to help you, shape the tone a little bit. We've got some performance options here, just a standard pitch wheel of up to 12 semitones, and we've got a mod wheel that can go from -100 to 100, sort of basic stuff there. We've got 4 separate LFOs, and just like the oscillators, each LFO works completely independently. So we've got, in this case, 12 different waveforms that the oscillators, or that the LFO can use. Each LFO, you can control the depth, you can control the rate. Now there are 3 different running modes. There's free running, there's tempo sync, and then there's free running retrigger. And so, free running and tempo sync, those should be pretty obvious. The free running retrigger is just like the free running, except every time you play a note, the LFO starts over back at the beginning of its cycle. And so the beginning of every note plays at the same point in the LFO. You can change where that beginning point is just by offsetting the phase of that particular LFO. And so again, you can have 4 different LFOs. Then there's the envelope section. So we've got 5 different envelopes here. And these are multi-stage envelopes. You can have up to 16 stages. And so just to change the shape of the envelope, you just drag these control points, and you can change the points, and you can change the curve, right? Just by grabbing the curve and changing that. So up to 16 stages. You can change the rate of the envelope. So it's a very slow envelope, right? Very fast envelope. There are 3 running modes for envelopes. There's the one-shot. So the one-shot just plays straight through the envelope. So if I press a note, it plays through the entire envelope. And if I speed that up, right, so it's just that, it just plays through it. The second mode is sustain. And what sustain does is it starts at the beginning of the envelope and it plays through until the sustain point, which is this line here. And then it holds there until you release the note, and then it plays through the rest of the envelope. So if I press a key now, it just stays there. And then when I release, it plays through the rest of the envelope. you set that sustain point with this knob. So if you have a bunch of different stages, you just change where that sustain point is. All right. The third mode is a loop. And what happens is the loop starts at the beginning of the envelope. It plays through until it gets to the end of the loop section. So here's your loop section. This is how you change the start of the loop section. This is how you change the end of the loop section. So in loop mode, it plays from the beginning of the envelope, it passes the start of the loop, it plays all the way through to the end of the loop, and then loops back to the beginning and plays that section over and over again until you release the note, and then it plays through the end of the envelope. So if I press play now, right, so I'm just holding down the key and it's playing through this loop over and over again. And then when I release the key, it plays through the end of the envelope. Okay, so those are your three modes for the envelopes. And again, you've got 5 different envelopes that you can pick from. Now back to this oscillator section, each one of the 4 oscillators can use a different envelope. So right now, oscillator 1 is using envelope 1, oscillator 2 is using envelope 1, so it looks like right now they're all using envelope 1. But for example, you can have oscillator 3 use envelope 2. And so now oscillators 1 and 2 and 4 will be using envelope 1, but then oscillators 3, right, because here we'll be using envelope 2. So in that way, your different layers of oscillators can now move in different times and in different relationships to each other. So it can get even more complicated. So that's just the basics of the envelope section. And then you have your modulation matrix here. And your mod matrix has a source. So your source can be a bunch of things. It can be LFOs, all LFOs 1 through 4, envelopes. It can be the mod wheel or aftertouch. There are CV ins on the back of the device, so you can have just a CV in directly be a modulation source, or the velocity of the key that's being pressed, or the note of the key that's being pressed. So those are your sources. Your destinations, there are a ton of destinations. So, you know, some basic things like master volume and portamento, and then basically every one of these knobs for every oscillator is a destination. So you can have the destination of the volume or the octave or whatever, or any of these wave shapers. And so if we look at 2, we can see that LFO1 is controlling the oscillator 2 sync. And so if we slow down oscillator 1 or we change the waveform, right, so we can see that's how we're getting this dynamic movement here. So back to our destination. So oscillator 1, you know, the pulse width, the spread, the blah, blah, blah. These are your wave shaping operators. And then here's the note data, right? The pitches and the unisons. And then oscillator 2 and oscillator 3 and oscillator 4. And then we've got our filters, the frequency and resonance for filters 1 and 2. You can change the LFO depth or rate or phase. So you can do that for all 4 LFOs. You can modulate the rate of envelopes, all the envelopes, and then you can change the values of our effect section, the reverb, the delay, and the EQ tone stack. Okay, so basically everything that has a knob, you can, a knob or a dial or a switch, you can modulate as a destination in the matrix. The amount that you modulate can be from 100 to -100, so you can invert whatever your source is. And then all of these modulation sources can be scaled dynamically. So to scale, you can use all of your modulation sources. So for example, you can have LFO 1 dynamically change the scale of LFO 4, as it modulates filter 1 frequency, right? So it can get pretty complicated. And again, you can invert that modulation as well, or that scaling of the modulation source. In the scale, there are the standard modulation sources, but there are also two additional ones. One is multiply and one is offset. Multiply takes whatever this signal is and multiplies it up to 10 or negative 10. And so this way, for example, if your LFO is going from -1 to 1, you can multiply it to go from -10 to +10, in which case you can overdrive some of these parameters, some of these knobs. And then there's an offset, which allows you to change the center of this modulation. So if this modulation goes from -1 to 1, its center is 0, but you can offset it, so maybe its center is 0.5. So in that case, its modulation would be from 0 to 1.5? I don't know. No, it'd be -0.5 to +1.5, right? So you can, this is just a way of, again, doing more crazy modulations to create really rich textured sounds. Okay, so that is the basic. I think we've covered. Oh, there are a couple of things up here. There's of course a master volume and a portamento, but there are 3 different play modes. So right now this is in mono legato. But there's polyphonic, and then there's mono retrigger, and then mono legato. Okay, and then patch browser, you know how that works. So that is the front of Former. Let's take a look at the back. The back, I'll unplug this just for now. We've got standard audio outs. Our envelopes 1 through 4 and LFOs 1 through 4 can also be used out. So you can have your LFOs, your envelopes controlling Former in your modulation matrix, but you can also have them control other devices in Reason. So you just connect these out to whatever you want to modulate. In terms of CV ins, we've got a gate and note, which is just standard. So if you're using like a matrix or an arpeggiator or something, we've got those generic CV ins 1 through 6, and those correspond to these CV ins 1 through 6. So you can just, any external CV source, you can use and route into your modulation matrix. And then there are a couple just direct connections. So you can directly connect and control the filter frequencies and the filter resonances. So this is the frequency for filter 1 and resonance for filter 1, frequency for filter 2 and resonance for filter 2. So just in case you want to directly control those. Likewise, you can also directly control the volume of the oscillators independently. So here's volume 2 for oscillators 2, 3, and 4. Oscillator 1 is missing because all of oscillator 1's parameters have a breakout section. So this is so you're not limited by just 6 CV external sources. You can now use a bunch of more external sources to really do crazy things with oscillator 1 and the volumes and the frequencies. And if you need CV signals to oscillate other stuff, you can use the generic CVNs. Okay, so there's just a lot of CV connections here. And then there is this oversampling. So by default, Former is set to oversample 4 times. This is about aliasing. So if the goal is to use as low oversampling as possible, because the more oversampling you use, the more processing is used. So if you don't need to oversample, then don't. So if you're doing like really grungy stuff or bass, I will often put it at 2 times oversampling, because that gets rid of anything that I would hear at that point. 4 is a good medium point. If you are playing really clear high notes and you are hearing some aliasing, you can go ahead and up the oversample factor to 8 times, and that usually takes care of most aliasing. But again, if you just automatically put it on 8 because you think 8 is better, it's probably more often than not it's not going to change the quality of the sound because you're not actually aliasing anything. It's just going to take a bunch more DSP. So my suggestion is to keep it on 4 as much as possible. And we'll route this back up. So that was pretty long, but that was a very quick overview of the functionality in Former. So again, if you want more detail, there are lots of little cool tips and tricks in the manual. Things like if you want to reset these numbers, you just double click and they're reset back to 0. In the manual, it has lots of little cool tricks like that. So definitely read that. But this should definitely give you enough understanding of Former so that you can open it up and load up some patches and start designing the sounds on your own. So I hope you enjoy Former. Thanks so much.